Welcome to tonight's edition of the Legislative Update, and we've brought Mark Messmer back into the studios.
Great to be with you again this week.
Absolutely.
Filling in for Bill.
Yep, again. So, seems like I do this every other week.
It's getting to be a rotation.
I know, it is just about. But you had a couple of bills of your own that passed through this week. Let's start there.
Yep, very good. Well, the first bill that passed was the bill that allows the Jasper Library Board to reconfigure their board district, the library district, to encompass the Madison and Boone Township areas that were brought into the city limits a few years ago. It allowed them to become part of the library district without having to reconfigure, their appointing authority. The township trustees for Bainbridge Township will still get their appointment. Instead of everything being within Bainbridge Township, they'll have to appoint somebody that lives in one of the new areas, and then the city council will get to maintain their current appointment that they had, and then the county council, county commissioners, still each get one from anywhere within the district, as well as the three school board members that are appointed, or three members appointed by the school board, could be anywhere within the overall district as well. So, good bill. We know it specifically will apply to Jasper. There's more than likely going to be other cities across the state who've never reconfigured their library district that are in a similar makeup that could benefit from it as well. So
a neat little cleanup per se.
Yeah, and it did pass unanimously in the House this week. So very happy with that. I did have one vote against it in the Senate from Senator Steele. He said on your first bill, nobody gets a perfect record on that. So that little friendly jab, from a Senate member, but passed through. No obstruction, no amendments, so it went to the governor's desk this week. And then I had the chemical abortion bill that we had to do some cleanup. It was written too specifically to apply just to Planned Parenthood clinics 2 years ago when we passed it, and a federal judge said it couldn't be that restrictive if you're going to have that type of a standard. It needs to apply to everybody equally across the board. So we struck the restrictive sections and made it applicable to any healthcare provider across the board. We allowed, I think we had an exemption that allowed, a doctor to prescribe up to 5 per year before they slid into that healthcare provider category. But anybody who does, 5 or more, whether it's an OBGYN, a hospital, a Planned Parenthood clinic, or anybody in that, in that type of business, would apply equally to all providers. And so it'll go back now to the Attorney General's office. The Solicitor General will take that back to the federal judge and say, here we've corrected this legislation that you found to be too restrictive, and see if, hopefully he'll lift the injunction and let the law then move forward to be implemented. Of
course, this was part of 2 years ago, or several years ago, all the big issues with Planned Parenthood.
Right. Yeah, and there were some other another bill passed, I think, that had some defunding of Planned Parenthood, and that was considered to be too restrictive, and there was other elements that got injunctions on them as well. But this one, if we just took the restrictive language out and made it equally applicable to all healthcare providers, then we should be able to get that moving forward. And we also, to all healthcare providers, had a little more detail of what kind of information they need to supply back to the Indiana Department of Health on any terminated pregnancies, just to get more complete details from all folks in the medical field. So, good piece of legislation. No amendments along the way. So it's also goes straight to the governor with no conference committee work, which is always nice to avoid conference committee those last 2 weeks of session.
So, what about your other legislation that hasn't?
I had the Propane Liability bill went through House committee this week. It was heard in committee on Monday. Then, when it was in the Senate Civil Law Committee, they gave it a little bit more favorable. I mean, I guess they made it more protective to the propane companies. The House amended the bill back to how it was originally filed when I drafted it, which I was okay with. I like the enhancements that the Senate Civil Law Committee did. It actually gave the companies a little more protection. The House amendments took it back to the original filing, and then I'll have to get the approval from the caucus to, to approve the changes that were made, or send it to conference committee. I'm hoping I can avoid that, but it shouldn't be very. I mean, the two versions were not that far apart that it wouldn't be hard to reconcile either way. So that should be on the that went through the second reading amendment phase on Thursday. There were no floor amendments, so Monday that will be eligible for final passage as well. And then next week we'll have our hearing on the farm winery legislation. So getting ready to move that one out of committee as well. So I'm very excited about that. One bill that I haven't been able to get a commitment from the Ways and Means chairman yet is the data warehouse sales tax exemption bill. I've been pleading my case weekly with the chairman to try to get it on the calendar, but like most committees, he's probably got twice as many bills filed to the committee as he can work in hearing time for, so he's got to pick and choose a little bit. I'm just trying to get mine on the ones that he moves ahead. But that one, since it did pass the Senate, I mean, if he doesn't, hear it on the House side, it is possible for Senator Hirschman to amend it into one of his other larger tax bills during conference committee time. So that one we'll see till April 29th. It's still got legs and could end up in another bill somewhere if it doesn't get heard individually. So Senator Hirschman does like that particular issue, and having the chairman on the Senate side backing a piece of your legislation helps. Several other pieces of legislation that I had filed that Senator Hirschman amended into some of his other tax bills, the logging operation, the tax exempt status for the tree farmer equipment, that issue is moving along nicely. One that Perry Spencer Communications had a little bit of difficulty with Department of Natural Resources. They were trying to charge them utility easements for running fiber optic cable through highway right-of-way that just happened to overlap the edges of Ferdinand State Forest, which is totally contradictory to efforts to enhance rural broadband across the state. That got amended into one of Representative Cook's bills that was heard last week in the Senate, and DNR wanted to try to get them to pull that out to be able to still charge companies for that. I had a pretty strong commitment from the chairman of the committee and the Senate author of that bill to leave it in place. So we're trying to enhance investment into rural America on broadband, and we don't need tens of thousands of dollars of unnecessary cost being built into those extensions.
Kind of as a bridge now into the state issues, can you characterize how the effort has been with the rural broadband? I know that was on the table. That has been on the table.
There's I guess Senator Houchin had a rural broadband study committee piece of legislation that's moving along. Just to I mean, it's probably an issue for the next 5 to 10 years. Getting rural broadband extended across the state is going to be a continue. How do we do it and how do we pay for it? And what policies do we need to do to help incentivize it? Part of the rural broadband initiative is also coming as part of Representative Cook's House Bill 1318, that deals with broadband issues across the state. That issue should probably be on the Senate floor for final passage within the next week or so. But we're looking at it in a lot of different ways of how to help get build-outs in communities like Jasper's doing in a partnership with Smithville, and how to get that extended out into the more rural parts of the counties. And a lot of it has to do with getting the infrastructure from extended the major arteries extended out across the state better, and then from once you get it to a metropolitan area, get it extended out into the rural communities. It takes investment. The broadband companies are working at cable companies are working at doing build outs, but a few $1 million at a time per year. But it just if they're going to do it off of part of the fees that they charge for their internet services, whether you're Time Warner or whether you're AT&T or Verizon, the different telecommunication companies are out there. They're just limited on how much capital they've got per year to invest, and they have put hundreds of millions of dollars, into infrastructure improvements across the state. But it takes time for them to do it alone. We'll have to eventually, I think, get the state involved and to help getting those investments sped along.
And of course, broadband is actually becoming a very underrated part of economic development too.
And it's really critical. I mean, if you don't have good broadband service, the being connected to the internet, being able to communicate to so much of the purchasing activity, and so much of that is dependent on high-speed broadband, for most businesses. I mean, there's very few that don't have need for that on a daily basis, and a limited access, is a limitation on being able to have jobs growth, down the road as well.
Okay. Continuing on with state issues.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's one everybody wants to hear about. We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But we'll start with the casino bill and the fact that they're now talking about pushing the live dealers element out a few years.
That's a possibility. In order to, for the bill to really have a chance at moving to help everybody, to help anybody, you're going to help everybody. You have the two horse track, they call racinos, casino horse track combinations, one in Anderson, one in Shelbyville. They've wanted to get, and they've got electronic versions of blackjack. They've got electronic versions of roulette and the different games, craps, the different things that usually are done with a live dealer in a casino. They'd like to replace their electronic versions of those games with live dealers. Along with that, you're going to, if that happens, you'll probably see some customers shift from French Lick and from over near Cincinnati, Lawrenceville, and the different southern Indiana casinos. We'll probably see some reduction in revenue. So there was changes to allow them, some things they wanted to do was get their boats on land. The French Lick wanted to get their tax rate dropped, because they're really would be considered more of a low volume operation. So the changes that French Lick wanted, getting the boats, and those, most of those boats are hitting their life cycle costs, and to be able to move them on land, do the changes that French Lick needed, and the live dealers, you really need to keep all those elements intact. If one of them would fall apart, then you'd probably lose support for the bill, and that's what's happened in prior years. And in order to get the live dealer policy in place, the racinos are, have even said at this point, they'd be willing to, to delay the implementation of it if they just knew there was a window in place that it was going to happen. And if they said if that's a concession they have to make, to allow the governor to feel like he can sign the law without it being perceived as an expansion of gaming, then they're willing to stage that in or delay the implementation for a few years if that's what it takes.
So French Lick's still fairly happy with?
So far, so good. There's a little, I think there was a for the actual casino site, they were looking at maybe to offset some of their losses in the entry fee that funds local units of government, and some of that comes even to Radius and some comes to DuBois County. The entry fees that they pay in as part of they keep track of customers that come and go each day. Part of their change was to eliminate that and then have the racinos, pay some offsetting revenue to French Lick, because French Lick would probably be the top top casino in terms of loss of revenue from the racinos getting live dealers, and so they would offset some of that loss, and then they wanted to get a food and beverage tax on the casino site, to offset the rest of their losses, to help keep the local dollars that are generated from that in pretty well intact. So looks like French Lick's got what they need, Evansville's got what they need, the racinos are going to get what they need, and if they can do some other minor tweaking for other what they call free play deductions and other pieces that the other casinos wanted, there's a pretty good chance they could get some updates to casino language done this year.
Now then, moving to the hot button issue that everyone wants to hear about as we wrap up, religious freedom.
Well, it's a hot button issue that it almost defies logic, and I usually try to keep things on a pretty logical basis when I look at legislation, and the social media world has really let that issue kind of blow up into something that it's not. I mean, the bill is really quite simple. It's written just like the federal legislation that was passed in 1993, passed by a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives. and a 97-3 vote in the Senate and signed by Bill Clinton. This bill does exactly the same thing. It simply says if government passes a law that restricts a person's religious freedom, it's got to be done in the least restrictive way possible and have to show a compelling need to do it. And typically those would be issues of public safety. You know, there's something that we need to have passed. It might be a restriction on a person's religious freedom, but we're doing it in the need of public safety. It could be an ordinance, it could be it could be a state law, it could be a city law, but it just says if the government is going to take this action, they have to show a reason for it in court, because it'll be something that gets challenged in court. And if the court says, yes, you have the right to do it, but you need to do it in as least intrusive way as possible. It does not apply at all to actions between, it does not allow discrimination of me against you. It doesn't work that way. And I've heard so many, it might do this and it might do that, and it might allow for discrimination against, you know, gay couples and et cetera. It does nothing of the sort. In 22 years of federal existence and states, we're told by the Supreme Court, if you want this protection at the state level, you have to adopt your own set of policy at the state level. And that's been happening for 17 years. There's never been a time in any court case across the country where me discriminating against you has ever been able to use this law as a justification. It does not allow discrimination. It prevents discrimination. And it only deals with government passing laws that infringe on religious freedom. And they just have to show a reason for it, you know, that deals, you know, somehow with a public safety element. It's just as simple as that. And you can't disprove every negative that anybody can dream up. I could tell you, Bradford, it might cause global warming. Well, you know, I mean, it's so absurd, the it might, it coulds that people have come up with that just can't happen with this piece of legislation. We had an opinion put together by the head of the IU School of Law, co-signed by the heads of law schools from 15 other colleges across the country, including Harvard, that wrote an opinion that said Indiana's Constitution is a little bit vague on what actual religious protection you have. It says you have the right to, you know, freedom of expression or freedom of religion, but it's unclear. They said, you know, that looking at our state law, looking at our state constitution, there's no directive for courts, you know, to how to implement times when religious freedom, you know, looks like is justifiable to be, you know, to be obstructed. It just directs courts on what to do, you know, what tests to measure, and then and then directs the courts to make sure it's done as unrestrictive as it possibly can be. And that's it.
And how this story continues to make national news and so forth.
Well,
my question to you on that then would be, is your refrain more of read the bill?
Read the bill. Just read the bill. It's not a very complicated read. It's a piece of legislation that directs courts how to apply, you know, where discrimination of government against a person might be allowed, and directs them how to implement it. And that's all it does. And along the lines of what was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court last year in the Hobby Lobby case, it sets up a definition that it says a closely held business, you know, meets the definition of a person. It says government action against a person and a closely held business like Hobby Lobby would be considered the same as a person. It doesn't work the opposite way, that it does not allow discrimination against anybody for any reason. And laws don't work that way when they're set up to be directed of, you know, telling a court how to implement, you know, something that might be an infringement on somebody's religious freedom. It just tells them how, you know, how to do it. And it doesn't allow me to discriminate against anybody. It doesn't allow me to discriminate against you. It's just not. And sometimes when you see what's going on in the world of social media, you feel like you're living in the Twilight Zone.
So now that we have all that cleared up, Mark, we appreciate your time
Sure.
this evening.
Happy to be here.
That's been our legislative update for this week. Thank you for watching WJTS. We are local people watching local people.